Pokemon 151 drops in just 3 weeks here in the West, and we're really excited about it. Looks like a great set, especially after the dud that Obsidian Flames pretty obviously was. It only added one deck to the format, but of course if you add Toedscruel EX to the conversation, somehow Obsidian Flame's score goes down. It only added 0.75 decks to the format. So of course, everyone's excited for a set that actually looks pretty good for a change. There's a lot of cards that people are singling out from this thing so far, but there are just as many that I feel like people aren't paying enough attention to, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Here's the top 10 sleepers from Pokemon 151. Let's kick things off with an honorable mention, and usually my honorable mentions, especially for a sleepers list, are going to be something real goofy it looks like you can have some fun with, and I think that Electrode is the best example of that in the set. Card doesn't look super powerful, but it does look like maybe the basis for a fun budget deck. This is a stage 1 evolution with 90 HP and a retreat cost of 1. It also has Electro Ball. It costs a couple of energy and it does 70 damage, but what we're interested in here is Bang Boom Chain for just a single lightning energy. It does 20 plus damage. Before doing damage, you may discard any number of Pokemon tools from your Pokemon. This attack does 40 more damage for each card you discarded this way. So if you have all 6 Pokemon you can have in play, they all have a single tool on them. This can do a maximum of 260 damage. That's not bad, but if you happen to have, say, a Revavroom in play or something like that, they're going to have multiple tools on it. Suddenly, even with just the one Revavroom, you could do upwards of 380 damage with this attack, but obviously that takes a ton of tools and you're only doing it once. Now I guess with some sort of bench to active manipulation like boss's orders or escape rope, you could do some fun stuff and make it to where you only have to discard a couple of tools to make this attack work. Of course, it only costs a single lightning energy. I think I want to really double down on how good that's making this look to me, but overall it's not making it look that good. It starts to look a little bit better when you begin to remember that we have stuff like Rotom in the format. These synergize really well. You use Electrode's attack, put all of these tools into the yard, and then you get that Rotom up there, and it can loss zone all of the tools that are in your discard pile and convert that to damage. So again, these cards look really, really good together. Ultimately, I don't think this card is destined to do too much in Standard, but it does look like a fun little budget option to just kind of mess around with in Casual when you get sick of playing with those big decks in Ranked. So I do like the card. It's probably not going to do a whole heck of a lot, but it does, like a good Electrode should, spark the imagination. Let's get to the real list here and look at some cards that I think might actually have some relevance in Standard and possibly beyond. Number 10 is Snatch Arm. This is just a regular old item. Your opponent reveals their hand. Choose a Pokemon you find there, put it on the bottom of their deck. You know, there is an awful lot of deck search in the format right now, especially with decks like Charizard EX running around. You'll have turns where the opponent will use, say, Pidgeot or another deck search effect to go get that Charizard, but they can't evolve it yet. Sometimes they'll use an RCSV to go get, say, a Pidgeot, but they can't evolve it to the Pidgey yet, right? So I have to wait till the next turn to do that, at which point a card like Snatch Arm is actually really good. Also combos pretty well with certain cards that'll bounce a Pokemon back to your opponent's hand, and you just snatch it out of there, put them on the bottom of their deck. So there's some interesting interactions with this card in Standard right now, and honestly, in Expanded as well, too. There's a lot more effects that bounce Pokemon in Expanded, so I could see this doing some work here or there. It's not a bad-looking card. Well, let's move on to number 9 here and look at Hitman Chan, one of my favorite Pokemon of all time, and I think we may have finally gotten a pretty decent one here. This is a 120 HP basic Pokemon with a retreat cost of a single colorless energy, and it has an ability called Counterattack. If this Pokemon's in the active spot and is damaged by an attack from your opponent's Pokemon, even if this Pokemon is knocked out, put 3 damage counters on the attacking Pokemon. This is not necessarily a new ability. We've seen it before, but not often on basics with decent stats and attacks. It also has the attack Excited Punch, 2 fighting energy for 60 damage, but during your next turn, Excited Punch does 60 more damage. I just kind of like this, but within a fairly narrow application in the current format. This goes in fighting decks that are looking for a decent single prize basic with okay HP, okay attacks, and an okay ability. This has all of that while having a retreat cost of only a single energy, which is really one more than I'd like it to have, honestly, but there's a lot of fighting Pokemon, especially the bigger ones in Standard right now, that have very high retreat costs some of the time. So again, a lot of those decks might be looking, like Tinglu, for instance, for a single prize basic that can actually do some work. And for just a couple of fighting energy, this can do 120 damage, a total of 180 over the couple of turns it takes to do that. But of course, you're exposing yourself between turns to getting knocked out, because 120 HP ain't bad for a single prize basic, but it's still pretty vulnerable a lot of the time. So I will say I don't think this card is amazing, but I do think that there's not a whole lot of options for decent single prize basics and fighting decks right now, and Hitman Chan helps fill that void a little bit. Let's move on to number 8. It's Old Helix Fossil. There are 3 fossils in this set. They all function just like the old school fossils from the late 90s, and this is the one that caught my eye the most. You play this card as if it were a 60 HP basic colorless Pokemon. At any time during this turn, you may discard this card from play. This card can't retreat or be affected by special conditions, but it's got this ability. As long as this Pokemon is in the active spot, your opponent can't play any stadium cards from their hand. Really, really neat card here. Obviously, again, this has to be in the active spot, so it's fairly easy for them to knock this out. But in the meantime, they're not going to be playing that Path to the Peak, and I think that might actually matter a great deal for a ton of decks in Standard right now, whether it's Chinpao EX, Charizard, Mew, right? I'm not sure that any of these decks can actually afford to add this card, but it is a really interesting card, right? If they can't knock it out, or if you just set it up willing to let them take a single prize off of you, so long as they can't play a Path to the Peak that turn, or any other relevant stadiums. There are a bunch of them, but Path is the one that I think this card helps stop the most. Again, so long as you can keep them from playing Path on their turn, you'll give them the single prize KO, so long as that means you can set up with the Charizard or whatever, the Genesect, it doesn't really matter. So there's a lot of cool stuff I think this card could help facilitate and really push past a problematic card in this format right now, in the form of Path to the Peak. Let's check out number 7 here. It is Sandshrew. This is a 60 HP basic Pokemon. You can scratch for just double colorless and it does 30 damage, but again, the ability, as usual, is what I'm really interested in here. The ability is Sand Screen. Trainer cards in your opponent's discard pile can't be put into their deck by an effect of your opponent's item or supporter cards. This is just a nice ability to remember that we have access to. This really nerfs like Pal Pad, obviously, but there are a few other niche things that this might affect in the format right now. But I will say, depending on what they do end up printing, this could be a card to, again, remember exists if nothing else. This has the same problem as, say, Old Helix Fossil, the card we just last looked at, where they can take a knockout against this fairly easily, but while it's in play all the way up until they attack the entirety of their turn in the early game, they cannot play anything that lets them do this pretty cool and important thing to some decks. So I do like this a good bit. Again, I don't think it affects Standard day 1, but depending on what else we see in the coming months, this could end up being a pretty impactful card. Number 6, though, is Wigglytuff EX. This card really impresses me. This is a Stage 1 evolution with 250 HP. It has a retreat cost of 3, which is kind of a lot, and it has Friend Tackle. This is an attack that costs 3 colorless energy. It does 90, but if you played a supporter card from your hand this turn, it does 90 more damage. So 180, if you have kind of facilitated this attack with double turbo, it does 160. But again, the ability, really cool here. Expanding Body. If this Pokemon has any special energy attached, it gets 100 HP. So if you do have that double turbo attached, you have a 350 HP Stage 1 evolution. That is more than formidable. It'll take a few turns to knock that out. Almost no matter what. It is weak to fighting, but that's just really not played very much in the current environment, so you really don't have to worry about that so much. It's gonna take a few bites for most Pokemon to finish eating this thing, and in the meantime, you're doing $160 or $180 a pop, so if they have to turn it back over to your turn, then if this gets to take 2 hits off of most Pokemon, it's going to kill them, and it probably will get those 2 hits. 350 HP on a Stage 1, definitely something you want to look out for. Even given the high retreat cost, I think this card definitely has a chance, especially considering it is not at all hard to play a supporter every turn, especially when those supporters are things that you want to play anyway. Facilitate this thing actually knocking stuff out, right? Boss's Orders obviously comes to mind, but, stuff like Iono to help, disrupt your opponent's hand and whatnot. You want to be playing those cards anyway. So I really don't think it's going to be hard to stack your deck with supporters. You don't really need more than 10 or 12 to play one every turn, especially if you do have deck thinning, deck search. Again, things like Pidgeot EX, which plays well with this because they're both normal type, right? So if you have Pidgeot EX searching your deck for supporter more or less every turn, then you're guaranteed the extra damage. I do think this card is one of the first one we're looking at that definitely has a shot. It just has to find a real home. Some of the other cards we've looked at so far, I think might have to wait a few sets or for more impactful strategies that they help counter to come out, but this is one of those cards that I think just in a vacuum is very good. It does have to find a home, but I do think it's undeniably a great card. Matter of fact, while we're on normal types, let's stick on that and look at Spiro and Fearow, I guess, for number 5. I just feel like these two go together really well, right? I mean, obviously one evolves from the other, but there's a reason I say these things. Spiro is just a 50 HP basic with a retreat cost of a colorless, but you see, it also can do 10 damage with speed dive for a colorless energy, but the ability here is evolutionary advantage. If you go second, this Pokemon can evolve during your first turn. Now, Fearow over here is a 90 HP stage 1, no retreat cost, that's pretty cool, and speed dive is 50 damage for only a single colorless energy, but it also has beat catch. Single colorless, search your deck for up to 3 cards, put them in your hand, shuffle your deck. So you got a Pokemon that if you go second, you can evolve at turn 1 and go search for 3 cards. That doesn't seem too bad. And of course, there might be times you can catch your opponent off guard, maybe with a boss's orders because you're going second, right? And speed dive something off of the table or just put a bunch of damage counters on something. So I actually think there might be some applications for this. I don't like that you'll probably have to play like a 3/3 line to make it work. And once you have made it work, it's a bit of a liability, but anything else, if nothing else, you can use this ability on turn 1 and then retreat it on turn 2 if your opponent's not able to attack it down. I do like the free retreat cost on this. I think it's noteworthy. So really cool card here. There's a lot of little ins and outs to it that I think kind of add up to more than the sum of its parts. Let's get to number 4 here and look at a Pokemon tool. This is Big Balloon. The stage 2 Pokemon this card is attached to has no retreat cost. There are some playable stage 2 in the format right now that people are playing. There's kind of stuff that's on the fringes like Meowscarada, and to an extent, there's stuff like Baxcalibur too. But again, I have to bring up Charizard. Charizard's a stage 2. Pidgeot already doesn't have a retreat cost, so this doesn't really affect that. But as far as Charizard goes, I think this does actually do a great deal for that deck, but I'm not sure that it's worth the slot. But that said, these kind of tools that decrease retreat cost are always worth looking at. I think Big Balloon's no different. Stuff like this has definitely done work in the past, so it's worth checking this thing out too. Remember, it exists. But let's go ahead and get to the top 3 here, where I'm going to go ahead and call a shot. And I'm going to say that Erica's Invitation might end up being one of the best cards in the whole set. Once it's all said and done, this is a supporter. Your opponent reveals their hand. Put a basic Pokemon you find there onto their bench. Then switch in that Pokemon to the active spot. This is a perfectly evil little card right here, and I think that there's a lot more applications for it than you might think. It looks narrow at first glance, but a lot of the same stuff I said about Snatch Arm kind of already applies to this card too, right? Any deck search that our opponent might be using in the format to go get certain Pokemon that they can't quite bench yet, this is very good against. Also, pretty decent against cards like Penny, for instance, if they can't replay the Lumineon to their bench right away, or if they pick something up with Penny so they could put something else down. So now you know that that Lumineon or that Squawkabilly EX, for instance, is in their hand. Well, this allows you to just drag it back out, put it in active, and get a pretty easy knockout against it. I actually think that there's a lot of situations where this card is very, very good in the current standard. Once you get down into the nitty-gritty of the meta where people are using cards like Penny to put that Squawkabilly back in their hand so it's not so naked on the bench, right? This can nerf those plays. So I really, really like this card. I'm not sure that it's going to be very useful on every turn of the game, but even if you just catch your opponent off guard the first couple of turns when they've already got a full bench, they've drawn into Pokemon they'd like to play later, right? This is pretty decent against that. So I do like it. I feel like a lot of times if you can get a Pokemon out of your hand, you're at least going to catch them in a situation where they have to take a couple of turns to either get energy on that Pokemon, to attack with it, or retreat it if they don't have a switch effect, right? So you might just be messing them up in terms of timing. Right? You might be grinding the game out of a couple of extra turns with a card like Erica's Invitation. Again, the card is a lot less situational, I think, than it appears at first glance. It goes a long way. This is a sweet little piece here. But number 2 and number 1 are both legendary birds from this set that I like quite a lot. Zapdos EX is up first. This is a 200 HP base EX Pokemon with a retreat cost of 2. It has an attack that costs 3 lightning energy. It's multi-shot lightning. It does 120 damage, and it also does 90 damage to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon that has any damage counters on it. The ability here is Bolt Float. If it has any lightning energy attached, it has no retreat cost. Looking good for Miraidon EX, I think at least. There's plenty of ways to stack this with energy, whether you're using Flaffy or Electric Generator or blah blah blah. So I'm not too worried about the 3 energy attack here. I do like the fact that it can also hit benched Pokemon. Now, I know that we're in sort of a Manaphy-oriented format here, but you can always do the old canceling Cologne boss's orders thing and start knocking stuff out with Zapdos. So I think that this attack is really good. 120 base damage isn't the worst thing in the world. It could be better, obviously, but when you're adding 90 damage and knocking out important Pokemon like, say, Kirlia from your opponent's bench, suddenly this becomes great. Now, you do have to finagle it to where you can put damage counters on stuff, maybe use Hawlucha or Radiant Alakazam to pull that kind of stuff off, but either way, even without combos and stuff, even without synergies, I think this card is just good. A single lightning energy attached, no retreat cost. I think that that is fantastic. But once you get to the ability to start knocking benched Pokemon out with relative ease, I think you've got a pretty good Pokemon on your hands. But let's look at number 1, which is honestly interchangeable with number 2. I don't necessarily know that Moltres is any better than Zapdos, but it does have the distinction of being a single prize Pokemon. Now, it does have 120 HP, not 200. That will make a great deal of difference some of the time, but aside from that, it's fairly similar. It normally has a retreat cost of 2, but with its ability Flare Float, if it has any red energy attached, it doesn't have a retreat cost. It also has a 3 energy attack. This time it takes fire energy. Long Distance Flight. Discard 2 red energy from this Pokemon. This attack does 120 damage to one of your opponent's benched Pokemon. They don't have to have damage counters on them. It does a $120, which is really important, knocks out Cramorants and other stuff like that. So I think that this is just a smidge better than Zapdos for being a single prizer, for being able to just outright attack the bench. I understand that Zapdos has an attack that does damage to the active Pokemon, and that's really important, but 120 damage to the bench is almost certainly going to knock something out. Also worth noting that Long Distance Flight may discard a couple of red energy from the Pokemon, but, you know, you've got things like Magma Basin in the format alongside Charizard EX. There's all kinds of ways to get the energy back. It doesn't really matter too much that you're discarding energy from it, so I'm not too worried about that. I do think that this might have a lot to it. It's also worth noting, too, that if you do Long Distance Flight, discard 2 energy from it, it's only got 1 left. Well, it's still got 1 attached, so it has no retreat cost. If it survives the opponent swinging at it, which is an ask, don't get me wrong, but if it does do that, then suddenly you retreat it for free on the next turn. No harm, no foul. It doesn't matter that it doesn't have a lot of energy on it. And now that it's on your bench, you can Magma Basin it at will. That makes a difference. So I do like an awful lot about this, and single prizes always kind of hold a little bit more value to me when they're good than double prizes, right? I will say both Miraidon and the Charizard decks, and just fire decks in general, would love a card like this, but I think that Moltres helps out the fire-based decks a little bit more than Zapdos helps out the Miraidon decks because it's a single prizer and those decks want a single prizer so much. Now, before we get out of here, I've got a bonus card I want to talk about, as well as a bonus combo that I think might actually be really, really sweet in Standard. Now, I couldn't make Butterfree quite an honorable mention, but he is a card I want to talk about before I'm done with this video. This is 130 HP Stage 2, which is kind of stinky, and it has a retreat cost of a single energy. It also has Whirlwind, 60 damage for a single green. Switch out your opponent's active to the bench. A pretty annoying attack some of the time, I will admit, but what I'm really interested in here is Bye-Bye Flight. You can double turbo energy this. You choose one of your opponent's benched Pokemon, shuffle that Pokemon and all attached cards into their deck, and then shuffle this Pokemon and all attached cards into your deck. If your opponent has no bench Pokemon, this attack does nothing. So really, really interesting thing here, and obviously goes pretty well with, again, effects like Escape Rope and Boss's Orders and other sort of bench manipulation and stuff like that. This is an interesting way to use Boss's Orders. Sometimes you'll already use a Boss's Orders in a dire situation to kind of bully something up to the front that can't attack or has a high retreat cost, and this is a way to do that and also kind of take out the active Pokemon that was there without actually, picking up any prize cards. But I do think if there's a problem Pokemon with a weird ability or something like that, then Butterfree is actually kind of an interesting way of getting rid of it, but I don't want to run rare candy or anything to get this ability. into my deck. So I'm not sure that it's actually very good, but it is a really, really cool attack that is kind of undeniably strong if you can fire it off. But let's look at the sleeper combo of this set, and I do think this might actually be really relevant. This is Hypno as well as Jinx. Now, Hypno is a stage 1 evolution. It's got 110 HP at a retreat cost of 2 colorless. It also has an attack that does 110 for 3 energy, takes out Cramorants, but still isn't amazing. The ability here is what's important. When you play this Pokemon from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon during your turn, you may make your opponent's active Pokemon asleep. Now, this is almost a sleeper just by itself, and that's not supposed to be some kind of terrible pun, although I'm partial to those some of the time, but I do think this is just kind of baseline okay, depending on what you're doing with it, but especially when what you're doing with it is Jinx. It's pretty awesome. Note that this ability doesn't require Hypno to be in the active spot or anything like that. This can just be on your bench, evolve, suddenly your opponent's Pokemon's asleep. That is incredible, especially if you have Jinx out. This has an attack that can put your opponent's Pokemon to sleep, but it doesn't need to. It has an attack that for 3 energy just knocks your opponent's Pokemon out if they're asleep. And it can be performed with just a single water energy and a double colorless, a double turbo. So that ain't bad either, man. What a combo. If you have Jinx inactive and just a couple of energy on it, suddenly you can evolve that Hypno and knock out literally any Pokemon in Standard. I think that's something you need to remember. But that is it for our 151 sleepers. I think that some of these may have a little bit more relevance than others, but I guess that's why you put them in a list format, right? So let me know which of these that you like, which of these you don't like, for that matter. You know, I can take it. I'm a big guy. And let me know anything that I missed. If there's a sleeper from this set that you've been looking at a little bit, drooling over, let me know down there in the comments section. What's looking good to you? That said, if you didn't see something that you like here, it might end up in our top 10 151 cards, which will be the next video that we do here in the next week or so. So stay tuned for that. We only have a few weeks to do that before 151 officially hits our shores. If you do want to see that video, and if you enjoyed this one, you might want to consider liking this video and especially subscribing to the channel. We need 1,000 subs to monetize content on this channel, and we're less than 80 away right now. So if you'd help me out with that, I would be really appreciative of those actions, man. But I just like that you're here. Thanks for watching as usual. This is a brand new Pokemon channel that's only been around for a month, and the response has been incredible. I really appreciate that. Everything you've already done has not gone unnoticed. You guys are amazing, and I hope to keep doing this for a long time. So again, just let me know how you felt about all that stuff down there in the comments section, and I'll see you again soon for the 151 Top 10. I've been Dev. Thanks for watching, y'all. Spread love and be kind.